At first, I thought it was a prank. There I was, coffee in one hand and newspaper in the other, when I spotted the bright orange paper slapped across my front door like a warning label on a box of dynamite. In big, angry letters, it screamed, "Notice of removal. Your unauthorized crops must be cleared within 14 days or legal action will be taken." I blinked twice, thinking maybe the caffeine hadn't kicked in yet. But no, it was real. I hadn't laughed that hard in months. Whoever thought they had the authority to tell me, a farmer on legally leased federal farmland, to mow down my own crops clearly hadn't done their homework. The emotional swing from confusion to gut-busting laughter to slow-simmering anger set the tone for everything that would come next. Because in that moment, without realizing it, someone had just declared war. By noon, the neighborhood grapevine was buzzing louder than a beehive in July. Word spread faster than prairie fire that the HOA president, a woman named Karen whose voice could cut glass, had decided that my farm fields were an eyesore. Her reasoning? The sight of cornfields behind the fancy new houses was driving down property values. I watched from my porch as Karen, clipboard in hand, marched along the dirt boundary line with two board members flanking her like bodyguards. She was wearing oversized sunglasses, a sun hat big enough to shade a small village, and an attitude that practically screamed, "I own everything I see." She gestured wildly toward the fields, talking loud enough that even without trying, I could hear every ridiculous word. She called it unkempt wasteland. She said it was hurting the aesthetic of the community. She even pointed out that some of the residents had complained their children might get lost if they wandered into the tall corn. I was halfway between laughter and pure disbelief. Children could find their way through Disneyland, but apparently cornfields were now considered hazardous terrain. I decided to step off my porch and walk down the dirt path toward her. The second she saw me, Karen straightened her spine like she had just been knighted. Her two lackeys took a step back, as if they expected a shootout at high noon. "Good afternoon," I said, doing my best to keep a neutral face. Karen tightened her grip on the clipboard like it was a shield. She informed me, in a crisp voice, that per HOA regulations, all landscaping visible from community roads must conform to certain standards. I asked her, as politely as I could, what exactly those standards were for agricultural land that predated the existence of her entire neighborhood by about 70 years. She didn't even blink. She said with a straight face that all land visible from their HOA jurisdiction was under their influence. That was the moment I knew I wasn't dealing with someone who could be reasoned with. Logic wasn't going to work. Facts weren't going to work. Only consequences would work. I smiled, the kind of smile you give a child who just announced they planned to dig a hole to China. I told her nicely that the land she was standing next to was leased to the federal government under a special program for agricultural preservation and veterans support. She waved her hand dismissively, as if I had just explained the rules of hopscotch to her. She said it didn't matter, that HOA policy was the highest authority in the area. I fought every instinct not to burst out laughing. Instead, I told her calmly that if she touched a single plant on that field, there would be legal consequences she couldn't even imagine. I could see the wheels turning in her head, but she clearly thought I was bluffing. By evening, I got a notice slipped under my door inviting me to attend an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for the next evening. Apparently, the board was going to formally vote on whether my crops needed to be forcibly removed to preserve community standards. I stared at the paper, marveling at the sheer audacity. I lived half a mile outside their actual neighborhood boundary. My land wasn't, had never been, and never would be part of their suburban playground. Yet here they were, trying to act like medieval lords extending their reach. I sat on my porch that night, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the cornfields turning gold and rust in the fading light. I thought about all the history rooted in that soil. My father had farmed it before me, his father before him, and now it served a bigger purpose, helping veterans heal through agricultural therapy. Karen had no idea the kind of hornet's nest she had just kicked. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee and made a silent promise to myself. If she wanted a war, I'd give her one, but it would be fought on my terms, quiet, legal, Devastating. As I turned in for the night, a feeling settled over me. Not anger, not fear, something colder, sharper. The knowledge that when you fight with roots that run deeper than money or power, you're bound to win. Karen had no clue she had just signed herself up for the most humiliating defeat of her life, and I intended to make sure the entire town would be there to watch when it happened. The next evening arrived with a heavy, humid stillness hanging over the town. I pulled into the community clubhouse parking lot, my old truck rumbling and sputtering among the sea of spotless SUVs and luxury sedans. As I stepped out, a few residents threw me sideways glances, some curious, some nervous, and a few openly hostile. I tipped my hat and kept walking. I had no reason to be intimidated. They were about to step into a storm they had no idea was coming. Inside, the clubhouse had been hastily arranged with folding chairs facing a long table where the HOA board members sat in a row like judges at a bad talent show. Karen sat at the center, flanked by two board members who looked more like they had been dragged into this mess rather than volunteering for it. She wore a crisp white blazer and a smug smile that made my teeth itch. She tapped her gavel on the table, calling the meeting to order with all the self-importance of a small-town dictator. We are gathered here to discuss the violation of community standards posed by the adjacent farmland, Karen announced, her voice carrying easily across the room. She had a poster board set up next to her with blown-up photographs of my fields taken from various angles. Red circles and arrows highlighted patches of corn and a few random hay bales like they were evidence in a criminal trial. I folded my arms and leaned against the back wall, watching the performance unfold. Karen rattled off a list of so-called grievances, everything from obstructed views to potential rodent infestations to depreciating home values. It was almost impressive how much nonsense she managed to cram into a single speech. When she finished, she opened the floor to comments. A few homeowners timidly asked whether the HOA even had jurisdiction over land outside the official neighborhood. Karen waved their concerns away, insisting that the visual impact alone gave them rights to enforce standards. One brave older gentleman stood up and asked why the farmland was there in the first place. I saw my opening. I straightened up and walked calmly to the front of the room. For the record, I said, my voice steady, the farmland in question is leased by the Department of Agriculture as part of a federal agricultural preservation initiative. It is legally protected. Your HOA has absolutely no authority over it. You are, however, currently engaging in harassment and attempting to violate federal property rights. A heavy silence fell over the room. Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She recovered quickly, plastering on a patronizing smile. "Surely we can come to a neighborly agreement," she said sweetly. I smiled right back. "Absolutely. The agreement is you leave my land alone or deal with the federal government." Karen's face flushed an alarming shade of red. She declared that if I refused to comply voluntarily, the HOA would take steps to remove the offending crops themselves and bill me for the cost. A murmur ran through the crowd. I simply nodded and said that every action they took would be documented and forwarded to the Department of Agriculture and the county sheriff. Karen banged her gavel, ending the meeting abruptly before things spiraled further out of her control. As I walked out, several residents looked at me with new eyes, suspicion replaced by worry. They were beginning to realize they might be dragged into something much bigger than they had bargained for. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. Karen sent me a certified letter with a final warning. I framed it and hung it on my office wall. Meanwhile, I called my contact at the Department of Agriculture, a no-nonsense woman named Regina who had helped set up the farmland lease years ago. When I explained what was happening, Regina laughed so hard she had to put the phone down for a minute. She promised to send an inspector out within the week to document everything officially. She also hinted that if the HOA really tried to interfere with the land, there could be criminal trespassing charges and hefty fines involved. I liked the sound of that. One evening around dusk, I spotted movement along the far side of the field. Squinting into the fading light, I saw a couple of Karen's cronies creeping along the fence line with measuring tapes and surveying equipment. They were so obvious it was almost cute. I grabbed my binoculars and watched as they tried to stake out some imaginary boundary line that would somehow put my fields under HOA control. It was like watching toddlers play pretend with real tools. I let them have their fun, knowing full well it would come back to bite them later. That night, my motion sensor cameras caught something even better. Karen herself, sneaking onto my land under cover of darkness, carrying a can of spray paint and some orange flags. She planted the flags haphazardly through one section of the corn, marking it like it was her own private territory. The footage was pure gold. I sent it straight to Regina and the sheriff's office with a short, polite note, evidence of illegal activity on federally leased farmland attached. Please advise. The next morning, a landscaping crew showed up. Big trucks, noisy machines, men with weed whackers and chainsaws. Karen strutted alongside them, barking orders like a general leading troops into battle. I watched from my porch, sipping my coffee. I gave them exactly 2 minutes before calling the sheriff. When the first weed whacker touched a cornstalk, I made the call. By the time the sheriff's car pulled up, half the neighborhood had gathered to watch. It wasn't every day you saw an HOA president trying to lead an invasion of farmland. The sheriff, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face like carved granite, stepped out of his cruiser and surveyed the scene with the weariness of a man who had seen too much stupidity for one lifetime. He marched straight up to Karen, listened patiently to her high-pitched screeching about property values and aesthetics, and then quietly placed her under investigative detention. It wasn't an arrest yet, but close enough to make Karen turn several shades paler. The workers stopped immediately, dropping their tools and backing away like the ground itself had turned into lava. I handed over my evidence, the security footage and a copy of the federal lease agreement. The sheriff nodded grimly and promised swift action. As Karen was led away for questioning, I tipped my hat to her in silent farewell. She had set this war in motion, and now it was rolling downhill with her tied firmly to the front. And the best part was, the real consequences hadn't even started yet. The federal government didn't move fast, but when it did, it hit like a freight train. Karen was about to learn that the hard way. The next few days were a strange mix of calm and gathering tension, like the eerie quiet before a summer thunderstorm. After the sheriff's visit, Karen had gone suspiciously silent. Her army of HOA followers kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact whenever they saw me around town. It would have been almost peaceful if not for the lingering feeling that Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat so easily. She was likely plotting something even more outrageous, and deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before she made her next move. Meanwhile, Regina from the Department of Agriculture kept me updated. They were building a case file, gathering all the evidence, but she warned me that federal processes took time. I was fine with that. Patience was a farmer's greatest weapon. It was just a matter of letting Karen dig her own grave a little deeper. One evening, just as the sun was sinking low and turning the fields a fiery gold, my motion detectors pinged again. This time, the scene was almost surreal. Karen had hired a private landscaping company, a new one, not from the local town, but from 2 counties over, probably hoping they wouldn't know the trouble she was in. Big trucks rolled in, engines rumbling, carrying heavy-duty mowing equipment. A few workers climbed out, looking confused as they glanced around at the open farmland, clearly wondering why anyone would need a full mowing crew for healthy, fully grown crops. At the center of it all was Karen, waving her arms and shouting orders like she was directing a construction project. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, and shook my head slowly. Some people just never learn. Before they could even start their engines, I called Regina. She picked up on the second ring, and when I explained what was happening, her voice turned ice cold. "Stay put," she said. "We're sending agents right now. And call the sheriff again. She needs to be caught in the act." I hung up and dialed the sheriff, who, to his credit, didn't even sound surprised. On my end, I grabbed my phone and started recording. If Karen wanted to keep giving me free evidence, I wasn't about to stop her. The landscaping crew hesitated, unsure whether they should proceed. Karen marched over and barked at them to get moving, threatening to withhold payment if they didn't start immediately. Reluctantly, A few of them fired up their machines. The whine of the engines cut through the evening air. I stayed calm, waiting. Then, just as the first blade touched the crops, a convoy of government SUVs roared down the dirt road, lights flashing but sirens silent. It was a coordinated, quiet show of force, the kind that meant serious business. Department of Agriculture agents poured out, followed closely by 2 sheriff's deputies. The agents quickly took control of the situation. The workers shut down their machines and stepped away, hands raised slightly to show they meant no trouble. Karen, however, charged toward the agents, waving her clipboard and shouting something about her rights and her HOA authority. One of the agents, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and a badge that glinted sharply in the sunset, let Karen rant for a full minute before calmly reading her the legal notice. Karen was being formally investigated for trespassing on federal land, destruction of government property, and interference with a federal agricultural program. If proven guilty, the fines could be astronomical, not to mention potential jail time. The look on Karen's face was something I would treasure forever. It was the moment her reality cracked wide open. She sputtered, she screamed, she tried to blame the landscaping crew, then the HOA board, then even me, accusing everyone but herself. None of it mattered. The agents had video footage, signed documents, and eyewitnesses. She was told in no uncertain terms that further interference would result in immediate arrest. Karen turned a deep shade of purple, her mouth working, but no sound coming out. The workers packed up and left as quickly as they could, not wanting to be anywhere near the fallout. The agents spent the next 2 hours combing through the damaged section of my field, documenting everything meticulously. Regina herself arrived later, walking the fields with me and surveying the minor but still infuriating damage. She assured me that not only would the government handle repairs at no cost to me, but they would also be filing claims against Karen personally, not just the HOA. That was the beauty of it. The HOA might have voted to support her antics, but it was Karen who had signed the work orders, Karen who had hired the crews, Karen who had directed the destruction. She couldn't hide behind the group now. She was exposed, vulnerable, and very much alone. As darkness fell and the agents wrapped up their work, Regina pulled me aside. "You know, she's not going to stop quietly," she said. "People like that never do." I nodded. I was already planning my next moves. If Karen wanted to escalate things, so be it. I had the law, the government, and common sense on my side. She had nothing but her own arrogance. 2 nights later, my fears were confirmed. I woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. Grabbing my flashlight and slipping on my boots, I moved quietly toward the edge of the porch. Sure enough, there were figures skulking near the fence line. I hit the spotlight, flooding the area with blinding white light. 3 teenagers, clearly hired or coerced by Karen, froze like deer caught in headlights. They held cans of gasoline and matches, the unmistakable tools of something far more sinister than simple sabotage. My stomach twisted in anger and disbelief. This was no longer petty harassment. This was criminal, dangerous, and absolutely unforgivable. I shouted for them to drop everything and lie down on the ground. Maybe it was the authority in my voice, or maybe it was the pure terror of getting caught, but they obeyed immediately. Within minutes, the sheriff's deputies were there, rounding them up and taking statements. It didn't take long for the truth to come spilling out. Karen had promised them money if they could damage the fields enough to make the land worthless. She had even promised to cover any fines or legal trouble. The deputies shook their heads in disgust as they cuffed the kids and led them away. I stood there under the harsh spotlight, looking out over my fields, feeling a surge of grim satisfaction. Karen had crossed a line she could never uncross. Now it wasn't just the Department of Agriculture coming after her. It was criminal court too. I knew the road ahead would still be messy, but one thing was certain. Karen had started a fire she could no longer control, and when the flames finally consumed her, I would be standing here still, the land strong and unbroken, exactly as it had always been. The news spread through the town faster than a brush fire. By the next morning, everyone knew that Karen had not only trespassed and vandalized federal farmland, but had also tried to orchestrate arson by recruiting teenagers to do her dirty work. The sheriff's department had issued an official statement confirming the arrests and the charges being considered, which included conspiracy to commit a felony, endangering agricultural land, and tampering with federal property. People who once followed Karen blindly were now backing away from her like she was radioactive. The HOA board members scrambled to distance themselves, some claiming they had never supported her actions, others pretending they had no idea what she had been up to. It was pure chaos, and for once, it had nothing to do with me. I watched from the sidelines, letting Karen's world crumble under the weight of her own stupidity. By midweek, Karen was formally served with federal charges. Regina and a team from the Department of Agriculture returned to town for a full-scale inspection and investigation. They set up a temporary field office right in the community center, parking a couple of black government SUVs outside, just to remind everyone who was in charge now. It was a beautiful sight, seeing those official vehicles lined up where Karen used to hold her ridiculous HOA meetings. The same residents who once complained about the fields were now falling over themselves to support me, terrified that their association with Karen might drag them down too. They hosted community events in support of farmland preservation, donated to the local veterans program, and even offered to help restore the minor damage done to the field. It was ironic how quickly loyalty shifted when people smelled real trouble. Karen, however, was not done trying to save herself. She hired a flashy lawyer from the city, someone who specialized in property disputes and who clearly thought he could bulldoze his way through small-town officials. The first move they made was filing a counterclaim against me, accusing me of entrapment, harassment, and defamation of character. I laughed when the paperwork arrived. A thick stack of ridiculous accusations and half-baked legal jargon. I didn't even have to respond personally. Regina's office handled it, filing a formal motion to dismiss on the grounds that Karen's actions were not just illegal but dangerous and malicious. Within a week, the judge threw out her claims like yesterday's trash. Meanwhile, the HOA board was imploding. A special emergency meeting was called, one that I attended just to watch the show. It was standing room only as angry homeowners packed into the clubhouse, demanding answers about how their HOA fees were being spent and how much liability they now faced because of Karen's crusade. The board president, a frazzled man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, tried to explain that Karen had acted independently and without authorization. Karen, sitting defiantly in the front row, shouted that the board had voted to support her actions and that she was simply executing their will. The room erupted into shouting and accusations. Some people threatened to sue the HOA. Others threatened to sue Karen personally. It was a glorious mess, and I didn't have to lift a finger to cause it. The final blow came when Regina revealed at the meeting that the Department of Agriculture had assessed the damages and was seeking financial restitution, not from the HOA as a whole, but from Karen herself. The figure was staggering. Between the crop damage, the attempted arson, and the cost of government investigation and response, the total bill exceeded $500,000. Gasps filled the room. Karen turned pale, clutching her designer handbag like it might shield her from the reality crashing down around her. Regina made it clear that if Karen didn't settle the debt voluntarily, the government would pursue seizure of her personal assets, including her home, vehicles, and any investments she held. Karen tried one last desperate move, filing bankruptcy to avoid the fines. But federal debts aren't so easily wiped away. The court ruled that because the damages were caused by intentional, malicious acts, they were exempt from bankruptcy protections. Karen's lawyer quit shortly after, probably realizing there was no saving her. Within a month, foreclosure signs went up on her sprawling suburban home. Her brand new luxury SUV was repossessed right from her driveway. Everything she had built, everything she had used to lord over others, crumbled into dust. The community turned against her completely. No one answered her calls. No one sat with her at meetings. Neighbors who once bragged about living in her HOA avoided her like the plague. She became a ghost, haunting the very neighborhood she had once ruled. Eventually, I heard she moved in with a distant cousin 2 towns over, trying to start over where no one knew her name. But small towns have long memories. Her reputation would follow her wherever she went. As for me, life returned to a peaceful rhythm. The fields recovered quickly, the crops resilient just like the people who tended them. The Department of Agriculture awarded me a grant for improvements and security enhancements, recognizing the importance of protecting agricultural land from future interference. Regina remained a strong ally, visiting often to check on the program and bringing news of other farmers standing up to suburban overreach. The veterans who worked the land with me took great pride in what we had accomplished. Every row of corn, every bale of hay, every patch of sunflowers stood as a living testament to resilience and quiet strength. We held a small community barbecue to celebrate the restoration of the land, inviting everyone who had supported us through the ordeal. It was a joyful, healing event. Children ran through the fields, laughing and playing. Old-timers swapped stories under the shade of the big oak trees, and I sat back, watching it all with a deep sense of satisfaction. Karen had tried to erase a piece of history, to trample over something bigger than herself for the sake of vanity and control. She had failed. The land had won. The community had remembered what truly mattered. And in the end, all Karen had achieved was the complete destruction of everything she thought she owned. As the sun set over the fields, casting long golden shadows across the land, I felt a profound peace settle in my chest. Some battles are fought with fists and fury. Others, like this one, are won with patience, persistence, and a little help from karma. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to see justice served with your own two eyes, standing tall on the very ground that others tried and failed to take from you. Even though the dust had mostly settled and Karen was long gone from the neighborhood, the echoes of her actions continued to ripple through the community. The HOA underwent a complete overhaul. New elections were held, and a fresh board was voted in, filled with people who had no interest in policing anyone's land or aesthetics. Their first act was to officially amend the association's charter to clarify that no authority extended beyond the physical neighborhood boundaries. It was a small but important victory, one that ensured no one would ever again attempt the kind of ridiculous power grab that Karen had. I was invited to the first meeting of the newly reformed HOA, not as a member but as an honored guest. I sat quietly in the back of the room while they apologized formally for the chaos and offered a donation to the Veterans Agricultural Program as a sign of goodwill. I accepted it with a simple nod, knowing it wasn't about the money, but about making things right. Around this time, the media caught wind of the story. It started with a small local news segment, just a few minutes about how a rural farmer had stood up against HOA overreach and won. But the story had all the ingredients for something bigger. There was drama, betrayal, resilience, and a satisfying dose of justice. Before long, national outlets picked it up. I found myself giving interviews on the phone and even appearing briefly on a morning news show. They loved the imagery of the farmer who fought the HOA and protected his land. Regina even made a few appearances, talking about the importance of protecting agricultural land and highlighting the Veterans Program. It was surreal seeing my face on television, hearing people across the country weigh in on what had once been a deeply personal battle. The unexpected fame brought a wave of support from across the country. Letters and emails poured in from farmers, veterans, and everyday people who had dealt with their own small tyrannies. Some shared heartbreaking stories of losing land or being bullied by overreaching local authorities. Others simply wanted to say, "Thank you for standing up and showing it was possible to fight back and win." I answered as many as I could, touched by the outpouring of kindness and solidarity. The land that Karen had once tried to destroy now stood as a symbol of resistance and resilience. With the grant money from the Department of Agriculture and the new donations from the HOA and the broader community, I expanded the Veterans Program. We added a new greenhouse, installed better irrigation systems, and built a small education center where visiting students could learn about farming and environmental stewardship. Veterans from nearby towns began to join the program, working the land, finding peace in the simple, honest labor of farming. Some of them brought their families, and soon the fields were filled with the sounds of children laughing and adults working side by side, rebuilding not just crops but lives. One of the most touching moments came when a group of veterans presented me with a hand-carved wooden plaque. It bore an inscription that read, "To the one who stood tall when others tried to cut us down." I accepted it with a lump in my throat, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, everything we had fought for and won. The plaque hung in the new education center, a constant reminder of how far we had come and what had been preserved. Life settled into a new rhythm. Seasons changed, crops grew and were harvested, and the land thrived. The fields that Karen once wanted mowed down blossomed into vibrant landscapes of green and gold. Every time I walked those fields, I was reminded of the strength rooted in the soil beneath my feet, the history and the future intertwined in every stalk and seed. The community, too, healed. Neighbors who had once been divided by fear and suspicion found common ground in shared work and celebration. Festivals were held on the farmland, bringing together families from all backgrounds to enjoy music, food, and fellowship. Children learned to plant seeds and tend gardens. Veterans shared their stories and skills, and old feuds faded into the past. Karen's former house, once the symbol of her arrogance, was eventually sold at auction. A young couple bought it, turning it into a cozy home filled with laughter and hope instead of bitterness and control. I met them one afternoon when they came by to introduce themselves and ask about the history of the area. I told them the story, leaving out the ugliest parts, focusing instead on the resilience and the victory. They listened with wide eyes, nodding solemnly, promising to respect the land and the community it supported. In quiet moments, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, I reflected on everything that had happened, the battles fought, the losses endured, the victories hard won. It had been a trial by fire, but it had forged something stronger than before. The land was not just farmland anymore. It was a testament to perseverance, to standing up for what was right even when it wasn't easy. It was a reminder that some things, the most important things, are worth fighting for. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields shimmered in the golden light, a small boy from the neighborhood ran up to me holding a handmade drawing. It showed a stick figure standing proudly in a wide open field, a small army of stick figures behind him, smiling and waving. Above them, in uneven letters, was a single word, Hero. I ruffled his hair and thanked him, my heart swelling with a quiet, profound pride. Not every story has a happy ending, but this one did, not because it was easy, but because the right people stood firm when it mattered most. Because the roots that ran through this land were deeper than any outsider's ambitions. Because when faced with arrogance and entitlement, patience, truth, and resilience proved stronger. The fields would continue to grow, the community would continue to thrive, and the lessons learned would be passed down from generation to generation. A living legacy rooted in the soil and the spirit of those who refused to be moved. The seasons turned steadily, the way they always had, and life on the farm settled into a peaceful, steady hum that felt more natural than anything else. Summer rolled into fall, and the fields became seas of gold and amber, the harvest heavy and rich. Each morning I walked the rows as the mist lifted, the smell of fresh earth and growing things filling the air. Every stalk, every blade of grass seemed to stand a little taller after everything we had been through. It wasn't just my imagination. The land had been defended, protected by more than just fences and property lines. It had been guarded by the spirit of everyone who understood what it meant to belong to something older and stronger than any one person or group. The Veterans Program flourished beyond anything I had dreamed. We received grants from organizations I had never even heard of before. Schools arranged field trips to the farm so kids could learn where their food came from. Retired farmers came out of the woodwork to volunteer their time, teaching skills that would have otherwise been lost to the years. The community rebuilt itself around the farm, not in the controlling, suffocating way the HOA had tried, but in a natural, cooperative spirit. People helped each other again. Fences were mended without being asked. Extra harvests were shared. It felt like stepping back into a better, simpler time without losing the lessons of the present. One afternoon, I sat with Regina and a few others at a long picnic table we had set up under the biggest oak tree on the property. We were watching a group of kids run around with homemade kites, their laughter rising into the crisp autumn air. Regina turned to me with a rare, soft smile and said, "Sometimes it takes a disaster to remind people what matters." I nodded, watching a little girl help a younger boy untangle his kite string. It was true. All the anger and fear and division that Karen had stirred up had been burned away, leaving behind something stronger. Community built not on control but on care. The land itself seemed to celebrate with us. That year, the harvest was one of the best I had seen in a decade. The soil, tested by experts, was healthier than ever, a testament to years of careful stewardship. Every bushel of corn, every bale of hay felt like a small personal victory. Each crop was a symbol of resilience, a quiet middle finger to those who had once tried to tear us down. We hosted a harvest festival to celebrate, inviting not just the locals but people from neighboring towns who had followed the story and wanted to see the place for themselves. The turnout was overwhelming. Tents were set up selling local produce, crafts, and food. Bands played under the open sky. Veterans gave tours of the fields, proudly showing off the work they had poured their hearts into. Near the end of the festival, a small ceremony was held to dedicate a new plaque that stood at the entrance of the farm. It read, "This land is protected by the strength of community, the perseverance of those who love it, and the quiet defiance of those who refused to let it be taken." As I stood there with the others, watching the cloth fall away to reveal the words, I felt something settle in my chest. It wasn't just pride. It was peace, real peace, earned the hard way. Karen's name became a cautionary tale, whispered in town whenever someone got a little too big for their britches. No one spoke openly about her anymore. Her actions had become part of local lore, a story told not out of spite, but as a reminder of what could happen when arrogance met stubborn resilience. Her house, once a towering symbol of her status, was now a cheerful home filled with laughter and warmth, owned by people who understood that real wealth was measured in roots, not fences. As winter approached, the fields were put to rest, blanketed under a soft layer of snow. The veterans still came by, tending to the greenhouses and preparing for the next season. Plans were made for new crops, new programs, even an expansion into animal husbandry. It was a time of dreaming and building, of looking forward instead of back. One evening, as I walked the fields with the first stars appearing overhead, I thought about how close we had come to losing all of this, how easy it would have been to give up, to back down, to let someone else decide what happened to this land. But that wasn't who we were. That wasn't who we had ever been. Standing there in the quiet night, I felt a deep connection to every farmer who had ever worked this land, every veteran who had found peace in its soil, every neighbor who had stood up when it mattered. I thought about the battles fought, not with fists, but with patience and principle, about how sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that seem the smallest to outsiders but mean everything to those who live them. In the end, Karen had been right about one thing. This land did have a powerful impact on the community, just not in the way she had imagined. It didn't lower property values or invite chaos. It strengthened bonds, healed wounds, and reminded people of who they were and what they could be when they stood together. It turned strangers into neighbors, and neighbors into friends. As the last light faded from the horizon, I turned toward home, the farmhouse glowing warmly in the distance. Tomorrow there would be more work to do, more fences to check, more plans to make, more seeds to sow. But for now, there was only the satisfaction of knowing that we had fought